Hi there, friends and family of Center for Spiritual Living Ocala. Welcome. I just did my Easter talk on Zoom and tried to link it to Facebook Live. It was another fail. So here I am doing my Easter talk again. So I felt bad that some of you guys were going to miss it. And anyway, I think it's a worthwhile talk. So happy Easter to everyone. And we know that Easter Sunday is the most sacred day in the Christian tradition as we celebrate the resurrection of Christ. The whole Christian teaching actually rests on the idea of the resurrection. And at Centers for Spiritual Living, we're not specifically Christian. My topic for this year, is rising above the BS, aka the belief systems that have kept us sick, sick, broke, otherwise playing small, and aka masters, mystics, and paths of enlightenment. And so, not to say I don't want to be disrespectful in any way that to call the Easter story BS, but there are belief systems that go with that Easter story that don't work for me or didn't make much sense. And so I actually want to approach Easter from a whole different perspective in talking about the resurrection story. So I actually have loved the teachings of Jesus and Christ for my whole life. I think that if we did what he actually taught in loving God with all our heart and with all our might and all our soul, and our neighbors as ourselves, that we'd be a whole lot better off than we are. With that said, I'm going to give you a little bit different spin on the Easter story. So whether you believe that there was a historical person named Jesus who walked the earth and who who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered and was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and was buried only to rise again on the third day. Whether you believe that actually happened or that it was legend or there's some mixture of truth and legend to it, who knows? Who knows? I'm not sure what I believe myself. I know that the fact is, here we are 2,000 years later talking about whatever it was that happened, and that there have been people who were willing to put their lives on the line for what they believe, and even willing to kill other people for what they believe. So something of significance did in fact happen. But the approach and what I'm going to talk about today is the events leading up to the resurrection and the importance, in fact, the necessity of Judas and the crucifixion. Right? It seems kind of obvious, right, to say that, but we don't really think about it, that the actions of Judas and the crucifixion were actually necessary for the resurrection to happen. So for those of you who may not know the Judas story, Judas's face or his not his face, we don't know what he looked like, but who Judas was and the idea of traitor, those things go together, right? In fact, that's kind of the definition of Judas, is a traitor or a person who was treacherous enough to betray a friend. So what as the story goes, Judas was one of the 12 disciples. He was very, very close, one of the insiders to the Christ. And at the night of the Last Supper, Jesus lets the group know that one of the 12 is going to betray him. And then he lets them know that it's Judas. And so Judas leaves the group. He goes and he meets up with the religious authorities, and he offers to hand over Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He then comes back to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he kisses Jesus on the cheek and calls him Rabbi, and this is the signal to the authorities that this is the man that they're looking for. That sets off a whole chain of events leading to the arrest of Jesus, his trial, the death by crucifixion, and eventually the resurrection, which we call the Passion of the Christ. So I want to make a little bit of a distinction here. In New Thought, we look at these stories and we look at the Bible in a little bit different way than maybe some other religious traditions. There was a professor in my ministerial program who said that the Bible did not show models of morality, but rather mirrors of identity. That the Bible wasn't necessarily telling us who we should be, but actually reflecting who we are. So in all of the craziness and the inappropriate or kind of sinful behaviors that we see in the Bible, we're not supposed to be those things. What the Bible is for us is not history or stories of people that lived 2,000 years ago, but it is like a living, breathing word that's full of spiritual wisdom and metaphor and stories that are meant to help us as we go through this human journey, as we walk the spiritual path. So to get back to this idea of Judas and the necessity of what he did and the crucifixion being part of that resurrection, right? There is no resurrection without Judas. And so, we look at the Bible again as stories and metaphors that are reflective of our lives and who we are in this moment. And so if we look at it, like the different stories in there are really stories about us and where we are in our spiritual development at different times. So using that idea, Judas, is familiar to all of us. In fact, we've all had the Judas moment, whether we have been betrayed by another person or we were the ones that did the betrayal. We all know what that moment is. You can't get to a certain age without understanding what betrayal is and having experienced it. And I feel that in many ways we're experiencing this Judas moment on a huge, huge societal level with what's going on now in our government. And I don't think it matters which side of the political spectrum you're on, whether you're Democratic or Republican or wherever you happen to be. You're probably looking at the folks in Washington, D.C. and saying that's where Judas is. Either he's in the White House or he or she is in Congress, and feeling very much betrayed by the people that are in power at this moment. And then we bring it back from the big societal level of Judas back to the, bringing it closer into the circle. That we've all had Judas in our personal lives, right? Most of us have experienced Judas in our relationships with people in our circles of influence, whether it's business partners, family, friends, acquaintances, lovers, whatever it may be. Every one of us has been betrayed, right? Somebody either turns out to be not who you thought they were. Maybe they don't have the values that you thought they had, or maybe they had it at one time, you had something that you shared in common, and then they changed, and now you feel betrayed, right? It's happening with family and friends right now, right? We have people in our own families and close in our circles of influence that maybe are on the other side of the political spectrum from us, and we look at them and think, how in the world could you have, how could that be your value? Right? You're not who I thought you were. And it's hurtful all around for folks. But here's the thing, here's the flip side. We've all been betrayed, but we've also been the betrayer. We've also been Judas. Without even knowing you, I can probably guarantee that someone in your world, somewhere along the line, feels like you were a Judas to them, that somehow you betrayed them. Whether it was intentional or whether it wasn't, if it wasn't what you meant to do, but still that's how they took it. There may be someone in your past or present that was really hurt by something you did or didn't do. Maybe it was, when you came out, or maybe it was that you fell in love with someone you shouldn't have, or that they thought you shouldn't have, or that you didn't take over the family business, or that life took you in a different direction than what you had promised to your friend or whatever. And that person may feel like you betrayed them in some way. Yeah. And so interestingly, those kind of betrayals, they can feel really, really terrible. It's really awful when you're going through something like that. But the fact is that those are not the worst betrayals that there are. Those betrayals, the betrayals that we look at on a societal level or among close people, family, acquaintances, we don't really have any control over those unless we're the one doing the action. But the fact is that we don't have any control over what other people do. And I find it really interesting as I feel myself spin out sometimes into that negative downward spiral that I've been coming into with this crisis that we're in, that I have zero control over what is happening on a national level. Absolutely zero. The only control I have is over my vote. And yet it feels so difficult, so difficult. But the fact is, again, that we have no control over that. So I find myself over and over and over again doing a version of the Serenity Prayer. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but I've been saying it a lot. And it's a little bit different twist maybe than the one you've heard. And it goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the strength to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know that it's me. Because that's the truth of the matter, right? The only one that we can ever change is ourselves. We can't even change our kids. Ironically enough, as I said, the betrayals of friends and family and loved ones are not the worst ones that we go through. The worst betrayals that we can experience in life is really when we betray ourselves. And thankfully, that is actually the place where we have the most control. Is over our own thought process. So those seeds of self-betrayal, I believe, are very, very often planted during childhood when our belief systems are being established when we're children. And so a lot of you know that I do volunteer work at Marion Correctional Institute, and I work with incarcerated men. I've been doing that for the past 5 years. And I teach social emotional learning, I teach nonviolent communication skills and restorative practices, and a lot of universal truth principles like what we teach in Centers for Spiritual Living. And one of the most transformative moments during those classes is when I teach the men about adverse childhood experiences. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, it's a scale of that measures the amount of the neglect, abuse, and family dysfunction that someone may experience in childhood. And so you get a point if you were physically abused. There's a point if you were sexually abused, a point if you were neglected. There's another point if a family member was incarcerated, or if there were people using substances in your home. Anyway, the highest score you can get is a 10, and that's not good. If you get a 10, it means that there has been a whole lot of pain and suffering and dysfunction in your life. And not surprisingly, our prisons and detention centers are really full of people who have been horribly abused by and neglected by caregivers, and then later on the system that was supposed to protect them. So the seeds for that betrayal are planted early on. If you can imagine, if you've not had this experience yourself, and if you've had it, that when the people who are supposed to take care of you, when the people who are entrusted to care for you don't do that, right? It's a deep and devastating betrayal. It's one, in fact, that some people never recover from. It can cause lifelong harm and dysfunction. I'm going to share a video to the website, to our Facebook page a little bit later, that's called Step Into the Circle. And it's the closest thing. I mean, if I could bring a camera into those sessions, that you would see what our sessions are like. And in one scene, this man talks about how his mother tried to hide her pregnancy from her family and flush him down the toilet when he was born. And he spent the rest of his life wondering what was wrong with him. Right? Why wouldn't even his own mother love him? Like, is there something that inherently wrong with him? And it's really heartbreaking, it's heartbreaking. But that's the point where the self-betrayal happens. Again, whether it's your caregivers or an authority figure or a teacher or somebody who says something about you and you believe it, That's where the self-betrayal is. It's in the belief that there's something wrong with you, that you're somehow not enough, that you are defective. And as soon as we internalize those beliefs about ourselves, that is the moment of self-betrayal. And that is the worst pain and the deepest and probably the hardest one to shake. And so that then brings about the necessity of the crucifixion, right? The crucifixion being the death of those old ideas, of those false beliefs, of those things, of those lies that don't serve us. And they're painful to look at. It's painful to acknowledge this stuff. Some people are so afraid to look at it or don't even realize that it's story, that they just carry this as their cross for the rest of their lives, never really looking at it, never really letting it go or letting it die. But, as the story goes, as the Easter story goes, right, Christ was crucified, and then on the third day, he rose again. There was the resurrection as Christ came into new life. And so I think about that as I think back on those people that I have worked with in that moment of awakening, where they come to that realization. And I tell them this, and I share this with you. I don't know how to drive this point home more, that you are not the things that have happened to you. You are not the things that you have done. You are not what people have said about you. You and I, we are something so much greater than that. We are the consciousness, we are the awareness, we are the one that has experienced all of those things, but we are not those things, just like we're not our feelings or our emotions or our actions or our behavior. We are the ones that experience that. And so, we're the awareness, we're the consciousness that's having the experience that's going through a human form. And there is a power, a presence, a something, whatever you want to call it. Some of you want to call it God, some call it the universe, call it the creator. It doesn't matter what you call it. Whatever it was, it brought you into being. And it breathed life into you, and it is breathing you right now. Who are you to say that you're not worthy? You didn't create yourself. You didn't bring yourself here. So who are you to say otherwise, right? Each one of us, we were each made to rise. And so that is the takeaway that I want you all to have, is to know that the deepest betrayals are the moments when we betray ourselves. And it's time to let that go so that you can come into the awareness and the understanding of who it is that you were born to be, and to be it, So we were made to rise. And so I leave you with that idea, and I encourage you to take the time to be kind and to be gentle with yourself, and to maybe be willing to look at some of those untruths and those false beliefs that have kept you broke and scared and otherwise playing small, and release them. It is the way to enlightenment, as Adyashanti said, and enlightenment is a destructive process. But at the end of that process, what we find out about ourselves and who we become in that process is so much worthwhile. We're going through a moment right now in the world, I guess, in our history, that for me anyway, feels somewhat like the crucifixion and kind of like the tomb. But we know that at the end of this time, there is going to be that moment where we rise and we come into that new life. And so I hope you have a good Easter, however it is that you spend it. I hope this idea helps you in some way. And shout out to my peers, especially to Dennis Merritt Jones, who planted the seed of that idea of the importance and the necessity of Judas and the crucifixion for the resurrection. And so I thank you all for listening. Next week, hope we won't have the Facebook glitch again, and hope to see you again soon. Blessings.